My next guest is Matthew Zakreski. Dr. Matt is a high energy, creative clinical psychologist and professional speaker who utilizes an eclectic approach to meet the specific needs of his neurodivergent clients. He is proud to serve the gifted community as a consultant, professor, an author, and a researcher. He has spoken over 400 times all around the world about supporting neurodivergent people. He is also a frequent podcast guest and can be found on many different platforms. Dr. Zakreski graduated from Widener University Institute of Graduate Clinical Psychology in 2016. He's a co-founder of the Neurodiversity Collective, which provides therapy, IQ testing, coaching, and consulting. Welcome to the podcast, Matt.
Thank you so much for having me. And there are a few things I love more than getting trade stories with somebody else who's in the trenches doing the work. So, and I think that what I do really maps onto what you do.
Yeah. And I'd like to hear a little bit about your trench story starting off, and then we'll talk about your work in general.
So when I was, my trench story, it has to take a step back to take a step forward, right? So I didn't realize the trench I was in order to climb out of it. So my first job out of college, I worked in travel sales, and it was a really great job. You're 23, they're paying you pretty well, you get a good bonus. There was a bar in our office, the kind of job where they'd be like, hey, like we need someone to go to Greece this week. And I'm like, I'll do that. I'm 23 and single, right? Like, yes, I'll go to Greece. And then they offered me a promotion. And I did the thing where I'm like, oh, I got to go home and think about it, right? Trying to play the negotiation game. But then I sat there and I realized if I took that job, I would be there for the rest of my life. And it wasn't the job I wanted to do. I had always wanted to work with kids. And so I came back in the next day and resigned. And they were like, wait, what? Because I was in a trench and I didn't know how hard it was, that I was being sort of shunted down a particular path. And I'm telling you that, Dana, the energy it took to break out of that trench into the path that got me to where I am right now, I mean, it was a lot of sweat equity, right? I mean, it was hard work. And my accountant that year was like, so just to be clear, you're going to go from making $70,000 a year and having an expense account to working with kids with severe behavioral disorders for $12 an hour. That's your financial game plan. I'm like, yes. But if I hadn't done that, I would not have gotten into grad school. If I hadn't gotten to grad school, I wouldn't have met my wife, and I wouldn't get to do the work I do right now. So my trench it was a sneaky trap because it looked very comfortable, right? But I think comfort can be its own trench because it's comfort that doesn't align with your goals and dreams can sort of point you in the wrong direction.
Yeah, and like you said that you felt like that wasn't maybe the right path, and that's why you decided to resign when you're about to get this promotion, even though at that time you might not have been sure what your next step was, right. But evidently that led you on the path that you are on now, and really like what your life's purpose is. So let's talk a little bit about your work. You told me in the pre-chat it takes on a lot of different shades. That you advocate for kids who are neurodivergent in the district where you live, and they often come to you knowing that they're not doing right necessarily by the student. But tell me a little bit about the jobs that you've had working with students before working in your current role.
I mean, I have had basically every job in the mental health world, especially in how it interfaces with schools. And, so a lot of times it's working with the kid to develop the skills and help them understand their brains. Sometimes it's working with the parents to help them understand like what their rights are and like how to best parent a kid like this. But increasingly, it's about working with the schools because schools want to do well by all their kids, but especially the most challenging kids. it's easy to sort of throw that to the wolves, right? Just be like, well, this kid's tough, so we can't figure it out.
Sure.
But with so many districts all across the country are saying to me now, like, we know you're very good at what you do. Help us do better by these kids because we know we have them.
Mhm, mhm.
So, I mean, I often tell districts it's like we don't get to pick our ideal student body. We have to teach the kids who walk through our door.
Yeah.
Just like I don't get to pick my clients. I see who, they email me and I say, well, it's find a time and we'll meet.
Mhm.
Like our responsibility is to serve the people who need to be served. And if we gear ourselves up for that, we are positioned to be much more effective in what we do.
Mhm, mhm. So tell me a little bit about like when you're working with students and their parents, and they come up with the question, why is my brain so different?
Huh. Oh, why is it indeed? So, so there are really two different kinds of brains, right? There's neurotypical brains, which operate largely within normal expected parameters, right? Like if you're 12, you're going to think and learn and socialize and express your emotions and have the motor skills more or less consistent with a 12-year-old. If you're neurodivergent, your brain develops differently, and there are pieces of that developmental process that show up in an asynchronous development. So you've got a kid who might be intellectually 15, chronologically 12, socially 9, and emotionally 8. Right? So you've got to intervene with that kid in 4 different zones because if we treat everything at the lowest level, then we're not going to give them the academics they need. But if we give them only the academics, then we're setting them up to fail with their peers. So that's what makes this stuff so complicated when you're trying to reach this kind of learner. And that's why, so I tell kids, it's like, your brain isn't good or bad. It just is what it is, right? The foundational to the neurodiversity movement is this idea that differences aren't deficits. And where we meet people where they are, then we're best positioned to help them overcome their challenges and play to their strengths.
So when we're talking about reaching students social emotionally, there's a lot of parents that you see as well outside the district that might want to pull their children from the district because they want to do homeschooling or unschooling. Um, and sometimes there are students who might be gifted and their parents feel that their needs are not met. So talk a little bit about that as well.
Well, and I would say that one of the biggest shifts I've undergone in my career has, has been how I feel about homeschooling. Um, I will admit I used to think homeschooling was weird, and it was only weird people did it, and and I realize now that like for a lot of families, they're in schools or school districts where they can't meet the needs of their kid, and there isn't an option that makes sense to educate this kid. And some families, you know, don't want to do the online thing, so they just bring it home. And as long as homeschool is done with rigor and intentionality, I think that it can be tremendously effective for neurodivergent kids because it allows for that almost complete customization, right? And, I mean, you want to talk about busting out of trenches, like so much of the trenches that kids feel about being in school are about things that have nothing to do with learning. Like, I don't want to wear these clothes. I don't want to ride a bus. I don't want to take gym. I don't, right. I don't want to take Spanish or French. I want to take Mandarin or Russian or
Yeah.
Portuguese, right? Like, and the things that makes, I have a kid who does homeschool who has severe, like life altering food allergies, right? And when his mom contacted me, she was like, well, okay, so like we can't meet in person because there's no way for me to control what's in your house. And well, that's great. I do all my sessions virtually anyway. She's like, "Oh, wonderful, right? So they do homeschool because that's a thing. Like, and when they go out in the community to explore things, I mean, they it's the way they keep people safe.
Yeah, and we also have a lot of kids who are cognitively maybe higher than the kids in the same grade level. For example, a middle schooler who would cognitively be higher than their peers. Yet, you know, if you put them in the traditional public school, they're having to deal with a lot of the peers who are having behavior issues and those types of things. So, and that might be the better solution, like you said, homeschooling. For those students. So let's kind of switch gears a little bit and talk about self-advocacy. So employees, I know a few colleagues as well. When adults are diagnosed as neurodivergent at an adult age and they're perhaps in education, how do they advocate for themselves as an employee? And also, they're bound to have students who are neurodivergent as well.
Well, and that's I love that you brought that up because the more we learn about supporting neurodivergent people, we realize like you don't grow out of your brain when you turn 18 and finish high school, right? You bring that brain with you to the workplace. And some of that is finding a job that's going to be accommodating for your kind of brain. But while you're doing that, you can absolutely do things to make that process more manageable to you. So a lot of the things under the umbrella of neurodivergence, things like ADHD, dyslexia, autism, OCD, are also covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So you can advocate for through your workplace um, to get accommodations that make working easier, right? I mean, I think every neurodivergent person should have an option to work from home as needed, right? Not like we got to apply for it, we got to get approved, but it's like the default should be I can work from home unless I want to come into the office, right? And yes, there are some jobs that can't be done remotely. Absolutely, right? If my favorite bartender didn't come into the brewery, I don't think he'd be able to pour me a beer. I think that wouldn't be a good fit for that particular workplace. But for a lot of us, like thinking about what are the parts of our jobs that play to our strengths, what are the parts of our jobs we like, and conversely, what are the parts of our jobs that drag us down? If you see both sides of that, then you're putting yourself in a position to make work easier. And one of the things I say often is that I can't make your life easy, but I can make it easier. Things like this are ways to make life easier.
Yeah, and I think, like you said, it's really advocating working at the office versus working at home, drawing upon resources. If there are educators that, do have to work in person, but draw upon resources that exist within the district. So we'll be releasing this episode near the start of the school year. So based on the students that and teachers get in their classes, what are some tips that you would give teachers who might be inheriting some neurodivergent students they've heard of from other teachers? Definitely, we don't want to come with that lens that the previous teacher had if they didn't develop the best relationship with that student. But what are some tips, especially when we're considering maybe our twice exceptional students?
Yeah. So twice exceptional are kids who have gifted level IQs and another neurodivergence. Could be autism, could be dysgraphia, dyslexia, whatever that might be. And it's really important to, when you're working with neurodivergent kids, to make your communication very clear and straightforward and do what we call meta communication, talk about talking. Pull that kid aside and say, hey, listen, I know this last year was tough. this is a fresh start with me. I want to do well by you. I want to know the things that you know that are going to make this better for you, because the more I know, the more I can help. One of the best teachers I know, she's down in Texas. She spends the whole month of September getting to know all her kids. She makes a whole file on them, the things they like to learn, things they don't like to learn, their favorite books, their favorite movies, their favorite Netflix, you know, and you know, and has them do seat work while she's having these interviews, and then she spends the rest of the year playing to their strengths. One of the things that I think any educator can do is to send academic and intellectual content through the lens of what kids like to learn and like to talk about. So if you have a kid who's super into Roblox, you can absolutely find a way to write a story about Roblox or paint a picture about Roblox or do some coding or a science experiment inspired by that video game, right? You know, if you've got a if you've got a kid who doesn't want to necessarily read Tom Sawyer, right? Can you find a book that has similes that maybe plays to that kid's interests, right? And teachers say, well, like, but that's like, life isn't about picking whatever you want. I'm like, sure, but also there are a lot of options out there that allow us to play to our strengths and interests, and we can still hold the kids to a very high standard in academic content. You know, I mean, it it's pretty straightforward to apply best practices in education just through the lens of what that kid wants to learn, you know, and if you can say that to a kid authentically, I mean, that kid's going to run through a brick wall for you, right? Because, you know, kids want to have a seat at the table. They want to feel like they're part of the process. And when we lean into that, I mean, there's no ceiling for what we're capable of accomplishing with these kids.
Yeah, a lot of what I'm hearing is that it's really being open to hearing what their interests are, taking the time to interview them, not just having that interest inventory. A lot of teachers will just have them fill out that interest inventory, but sitting down with them and then playing upon their strengths, like you said, not being tied to a particular book that they have taught from year to year, but maybe doing something similar, having the students turn in assignments that might be through a different way, like video, audio, instead of the writing component. Um, Also, for a lot of neurodivergent people, they feel like they have the imposter syndrome. They feel like a fraud all the time. So, why do neurodivergent people why are they more susceptible to having imposter syndrome?